No matter how much you work out, your body burns roughly the same number of calories every day.
Men are getting 19,000 steps a day. Women get 13,000 steps a day. These folks have the same daily energy expenditures as you and me. If you exercise, you have less stress response. So you'll produce less cortisol, less epinephrine during the course of the day. A man in the US is burning about 3,000 calories a day on average. Women burn about 2,400 calories a day on average. If we look sort of minute to minute, your metabolism, of course, can go up or down if you're exercising or stills. There's a lot of misinformation and just a lot of lack of understanding about how our bodies work. Each of us is unique in our genetics, and of course, our recent ancestry kind of will have some effect on our genetics as well. All populations around the globe share over 90% of their genetic variation. But we know that people, we're not saying everybody's exactly the same and equal, right? Because we know that's not true.
In each episode, we dwell into the realms of wellness, exploring the latest trends, expert advice, and practical tips to help lead you a happy, healthier life. We aim to bring a broader perspective to our American audience on issues that impact your daily life by interviewing guests from the US and around the world. From nutrition and fitness to mental well-being and beyond, we're here to empower you with knowledge and inspiration. So whether you're looking to boost your energy, revamp your diet, or simply trying to find a balance in your lifestyle, you're at the right place. Join us as we embark on a journey towards a better, brighter you. I'm your host, Dr. Amir Khan, and together let's unlock the secrets to living life to its fullest. For years, we've been told that burning more calories means losing more weight. You hit the gym, you run longer, and the pounds are gonna shed off, right? Well, groundbreaking research has turned our understanding of metabolism quite a bit different. What if I told you no matter how much you work out, your body burns roughly the same number of calories every day? Because research now reveals a shocking truth. Your body has a limit on its metabolism. No matter how hard you push yourself, your caloric burn stays within a set range. So if your exercise alone won't help you lose weight, or will it? Welcome to KhanKlinics. I'm your host, Dr. Amir Khan. We have an amazing and well-renowned guest today who has changed the way scientists, doctors, fitness experts think about weight loss and health. Our guest is Dr. Herman Pontzer. He's a renowned evolutionary anthropologist and a metabolism expert. He's serving as a professor of evolutionary anthropology at Duke University. His PhD is earned from Harvard University, where he laid the foundation for his groundbreaking research on human energy expenditure. His book, Burn New Research, blows the lid off how we really burn calories, lose weight, and stay healthy, has shattered many myths about metabolism. His upcoming new book, Adaptable, launches on March the 25th, gives us a new understanding of how our body works, how to keep them healthy, and how our biology and diversity unites us. He's a leading voice in the scientific world. Dr. Pontzer's research on the Hadza hunter gatherers of Tanzania has transformed the global conversation on health, fitness, and human evolution. His amazing and revealing work has featured in the New York Times, National Geographic, and Scientific American. Dr. Pontzer, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, there's a lot to talk about, but why don't we start from your work? Tell us who you are and what does it mean to be an evolutionary anthropologist.
Yeah, thank you. So, I'm a professor of evolutionary anthropology. Anthropology is the study of people. Evolutionary anthropology is the study of our evolution and how that the biological background shapes our bodies the way they work today and kind of provides a framework for understanding how our bodies function, right? Because, of course, our bodies are the product of millions of years of evolution. And so to understand how that shaping happened, I think it provides a lot of insight on how our bodies work today.
Excellent. Where do you think you have contributed to the field and how so differently from others?
Yeah, so thinking about the evolution of our species or any species, energy is really, it's the currency of life, right? So we're thinking about energy a lot in terms of how any species gets its energy from its environment, how it spends it on growth, reproduction, movement, all these things. But a lot of times that science doesn't necessarily measure the calories directly. Yeah, so it's sort of making assumptions about how energy is spent, estimating it, that kind of thing. I think my big contribution has been to really measure, to put some numbers on things, to go out and measure how many calories are being burned in different lifestyles, with different activities, under different conditions, even across different species. And, when you start measuring things, you often get surprised. You think you know how it works, and then you go out and actually measure it, and you go, oh, wait a second, it's not what we thought. And so I think that the big breakthroughs we've been able to make from my work have been sort of based just in the curiosity of really putting numbers on things, really measuring them to understand it, and seeing where the results take us.
Well, on that topic, we've been told for years, more exercise, more calories burned. Your research doesn't prove or contradicts that.
Yeah. So one of the things that we wanted to do sort of early in my career was to understand how our metabolism looks, outside of the kind of industrialized context where so much of our research happens. Often biomedical research, for example, happens in cities or developed nations, of course, because that's where the resources are. But human diversity is vast, and we know the lifestyles we live today aren't really like the lifestyles that we used to live in, even just a few generations ago. And there's this big idea in public health, as you can appreciate, that modern life is more sedentary, and so perhaps we're burning fewer calories, and maybe that's why we have this obesity problem. But if we really want to test that idea, I mean, it sounds obvious, but actually, how would we test that? And so to test that idea, some colleagues and I went to work with a hunting and gathering community in northern Tanzania. So these folks don't have any domesticated crops or domesticated animals, no electricity. I mean, they live in grass houses in the middle of the savannah in Africa. And you can imagine it's a really physically active lifestyle. Men are getting 19,000 steps a day. Women get 13,000 steps a day. And that's in addition to all the other work they do to get food just to stay alive, to live their lives. And we wanted to know, do you burn more calories in this really physically active lifestyle, or how many more, And when we went and did the actual measurements, we were totally shocked to find that these folks have the same daily energy expenditures as you and me and the rest of us here in the industrialized world. And so that really kind of put things on its head about how we thought about activity and expenditure. Because if you can be really physically active, but not have more calorie expenditure every day, then obviously the body's doing something interesting that we need to understand.
Well, excellent. Thank you for explaining that. And it's really an eye-opener and a shocking revelation.
Yeah.
Explain to us, where does those extra energy goes? What happens, and how is the body prioritizing? What's going on?
That's exactly that's the big question, right? The last 10 years. So we made this initial discovery in 2012 was the first paper. I should say that we've found this in other studies too. So it's not just this one interesting population. We see this again and again. Activity level doesn't really change your expenditure very much. Sometimes it does a bit, but it's always a small effect. And instead, the body seems to be working kind of behind the scenes to keep you within a narrow range of expenditure. So somehow the body's saving calories. Where is it saving the calories? And we're trying to figure that out. We've been working on that for a few years now. Some of the ideas we have right now are that if you are more active, your body will spend less energy on inflammation and other unnecessary immune function, for example. And we think that because if we look at athletes or people who exercise a lot, versus people who are really sedentary, people who are more active have lower inflammation. And as you can appreciate, inflammation is just your immune system doing work it doesn't need to do, right? So you can save energy by having less inflammation. We also know that if you exercise, you have less stress response. So you'll produce less cortisol, less epinephrine during the course of the day, right? You'll respond less, your heart rate will go up less to stressful stimuli. And finally, we know that when people are exercising a lot, their reproductive hormones are moderated a bit. So estrogen levels in women or testosterone levels in men are brought down into a sort of a health, what we think are probably a healthier range. Obviously, if you go too far, you can push the reproductive system down too much. You get overtraining syndrome. Women will stop cycling, that kind of thing. But we think there's sort of a healthy middle range where people are active, and it keeps those reproductive hormones in a healthier range. So those are the kinds of ways we think the body is saving energy. But I should tell your listeners and everybody else, we're still working on this, right? This is still an active area of research, is how this all works.
Excellent. Well, thank you for clarifying, and thanks for giving an insight into it, Dr. Pontzer. Doctor, I want to go into your book, the last one you wrote about, called Burn. And there were several myths that you debunked. Give us a few of them, and then I'm sure the readers would love then to go and read your book to find out more. But what are the ones that you mostly would like to highlight and feel proud of?
Yeah. So we can start with the real basics. First of all, everybody thinks they burn 2,000 calories a day, it seems, right? If you ask somebody how many calories they eat or how many calories they burn, they say about 2,000. In fact, our expenditure is much higher than that, and so is our intake. So a man in the US is burning about 3,000 calories a day on average. Women burn about 2,400 calories a day on average. And that difference is due to size differences, right? Men tend to be bigger and tend to have more lean mass, and that's what really picks up your metabolic rate. So this idea that you only burn 2,000 calories really isn't true. We talked about the myth around exercise, right? Exercise is really good for you, so I want to be really clear about that. But this idea that you can really push your metabolic rate really high with exercise, it turns out that's not really the case. The body kind of pushes back. And so you might be able to push your metabolism around a little bit with exercise, but the effect is really small. And because of that, the impact of exercise on weight loss is really small. So there's another metabolic myth for you. And then I guess finally, I'd say, a fun one that we kind of tackle in that book and also in the new book, Adaptable, is that there's sort of just one human diet that's natural and that we should all be striving to focus on. In fact, humans eat a really wide range of diets. If we look around the globe and over, through time, we look at traditional populations, modern populations, people can thrive and be healthy on a really wide range of diets. It's one of the things that makes us so adaptable. We're able to eat a lot of different kinds of foods and make that work in a healthy way. So there isn't just one paleo diet or ancestral diet or anything like that. Humans are built to be broad omnivores.
Excellent. Well, thank you for explaining that. That's amazing. So if you want to find more about what is our caloric requirements, whether exercise has an impact or not on weight loss, and then something about diet, which we've been discussing a lot lately, you're gonna have to go and read the book Burn by Dr. Herman Pontzer in detail, so we can get a few more of the topics covered there. We're going to go on to a next topic, Dr. Pontzer, and that is about how does the body adapt its energy expenditure? And that's in response to its environment that it's in, whether it's in an extreme environment, hot or cold, or whether there is food or not food. Would you just highlight a little bit on that topic based on the research that you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if we look sort of minute to minute, your metabolism, of course, can go up or down if you're exercising or still. So that's the easiest one that we all have an intuition about. But your body is burning calories all the time. You've got 37 trillion cells that are all hard at work, and that is your metabolism. That work they do is the calories you're burning. And the context you're in, the environment you're in, can push that work around, basically. So if you're in a really cold environment, for example, even before you start shivering, your body will start burning extra heat to stay warm. You've got this special kind of fat called brown adipose tissue that will start burning itself. Its whole job is to burn energy to keep you warm. And then, of course, if that doesn't do it, then you'll start shivering and hopefully be able to warm up that way. Your body responds, to diet. If you try to crash diet, right, lose a lot of weight really fast, your metabolic rate will also crash because your body doesn't want to lose weight typically. If you think about this is one of the advantages you think you have from an evolutionary perspective on things. If you think about the evolution of life and of our species, losing a lot of weight is usually a bad thing, right? It usually means you're starving or not getting enough food. And so your body has all these really clever evolved responses to reduce your metabolic rate when food isn't available. So if you starve yourself with a really crash diet, the metabolic rate will come down in response to that. And then, of course, there's some of the adaptation that we've been talking about, which is as you're more active or less active, your body is sort of responding to that level of activity as well. And if you start a new exercise program today, then for a while you're burning all of that energy on exercise just like you think. But after a few months, the background expenditures have been shifted a bit, so you're not burning quite as much as you thought you would just from the exercise alone. So your body's always adapting to its environment. It's one of the most amazing things about our body is how sort of responsive it is to the way we live.
Excellent. Well, thank you for explaining that, Dr. Pontzer. We'll go on to your latest upcoming new book. We're all looking forward to reading it, Adaptability. Give us a little overview first. In your eyes, what made you write the book, and what sort of message are you thinking of conveying to the reader?
Yeah, thanks. So I think I love to talk science. I love to teach. And I really enjoyed writing my last book, Burn. And what I realized in writing that book was that there's a lot of misinformation and just a lot of lack of understanding about how our bodies work, right? That it was very obvious when we were talking about metabolism, and I was writing about that and talking about that with Burn. And I thought, I've been teaching physiology at the college level for about 20 years now. And what I would love to do is share with everyone a better understanding of how our bodies work. A lot of people probably haven't had any human physiology since high school, if they had it at all. And so the idea is to go, bit by bit, head to toe, system by system, and try to help people understand how our bodies work. How do we grow up? How do we grow old? How do our hearts and lungs work? How do our brains work? How does our immune system work? And in each of these chapters, what I've found is that if we talk about immune system, for example, well, then let's talk about some of the issues of the day. So with the immune system, we can talk about vaccines and the importance of that. We talk about brains, we can talk about how brains work, but we can also talk about the discussion around intelligence and how do we understand intelligence, right? So I think writing the book made me realize our biology touches so many big, important topics of the day, whether it's IQ or vaccinations or, sex and gender or, the beginnings of life and embryology. All these topics are sort of, they rest on our biology. And if we don't have that fluency, of course, we have a hard time engaging in those conversations. So I wanted to write a book that would do that, help us understand this amazing body that we all are going to live our lives in, but then also kind of touch on the social issues that are going to connect to that.
Thank you for explaining that, Dr. Pontzer. One of the issues you've discussed is race. And you've mentioned that race is not a biological construct, but acknowledges more biologic variation that exists among different populations and different races. Would you like to explain or elaborate a little bit? What's the importance of the race? How does it help diversity? And how do we recognize this biological difference?
Sure. No, thank you. So, again, from an anthropology background, most of my work is studying human diversity. And you end up with an understanding of how our bodies work and how our bodies are different that ends up being very, very much different than a kind of race-based view of our diversity. Yeah. And so each of us is unique in our genetics. And of course, our recent ancestry kind of will have some effect on our genetics as well. But if we look at sort of race-based ideas about our diversity, they usually get it very wrong. And so when we say that race isn't a biological construct, what we mean is there's no genetic coherence to race. There's more genetic diversity within, for example, African Americans or within Africa for that matter. When we say that race is not a biological construct, what we mean is that there's no sort of genetic boundaries around the different races. We're all populations around the globe share over 90% of their genetic variation, right? So we're all incredibly closely related genetically. And the racial categories that we use that are socially constructed don't really get any of that diversity right. I'll give you an example in sort of why this matters. We know that African Americans in the US have higher rates of hypertension, right? And that's been true for decades now, ever since anybody's sort of been paying attention. And in the 80s and 90s, there was this belief that, well, high rates of hypertension, heart disease in African Americans and Black Americans was because there was some genetic predisposition in Black Americans that made them likely to have heart disease. That is a sort of race-based view of our diversity. And, it's wrong. What it actually is happening is It's the social and sort of economic pressures and racial pressures around race in this country that are causing this difference in hypertension. There's nothing genetic about it. And we know that because if we look at Black populations outside of the US, if we look at Black populations in Africa, for example, or in other countries where that we don't have this history of racism, we don't see hypertension. And so when we think about race as the reason, we will get it wrong, and we'll make the wrong kind of conclusions about how we would treat hypertension, that it was higher in one group than another. If we see it as an environmental issue, then okay, now we have some answers, or at least some directions to go to try to make it better.
Okay, let's talk about sex and gender a little bit. And in this book, again, you discuss the complexities of sex and gender. You're acknowledging again the biological differences that exist, and you promote, I would say, a bit of understanding of the interplay between biology and the social identity. Explain a little bit from your book and your research. What's the conclusion? What's your final conclusion and research on how sex and gender versus the part that it plays in our society and anthropology in general?
Yeah, so that was a really fun chapter to get into and write and explore. No matter where you look around the globe, cultures everywhere have different rules about how men and women are supposed to interact, and some rules are some cultures have them quite separate, some cultures have them very much together, some cultures have one in charge or the other. And so there's always social rules around men and women and around gender. But what's the same everywhere is the biology of sex. And so I want to separate for a moment, and we talk about this in the book, that we can think about the physiology, the biology of our bodies, the anatomy we have, our hormones, chromosomes, the kind of, do we make sperm or do we make eggs, right? So there's the biology of sex, and let's understand that and how that develops. And what we see is that, there are these sex differences on average between men and women in terms of height or strength, that kind of thing. We don't see differences, for example, in intelligence or anything like that. But then, so that's the biology, because there really are some differences on average. There are other ways in which there really aren't differences. And then we can ask the question, well, what are we going to do about that? And how are we going to manage that? And that's where we get into this question of gender and how our society treats these differences, right? And so in the US, we've had this, real reckoning of how we're going to think about men and women and males and females. And so, we're in the middle of that debate, and that's a big societal debate that I'm not going to try to solve. But the goal is to sort of understand, because you hear it from both sides. You hear people saying on one side, there is no difference in between the sexes, and it's all just, sort of what we imagine it to be or what we want it to be. That, however you identify will determine, sex is meaningless. That's not really what we find when we look at the data. There are real male-female differences in terms of, for example, average strength and size. On the other hand, you have people who say, well, your biology is all we need to know. There is no gender, right? People don't have, the sex is all there is. But of course, we know that, again, across cultures and through time, we see that there's always a biology underlying this, but cultures have different ways of talking about the gendered behaviors and roles of males and females. And often have, transgender and third gender people. And so there's a biology of it, which is what the book's all about. Let's use that to springboard into an informed discussion about how we're going to, take on this complicated subject.
It is indeed complicated, and especially when you just mention in the last sentence about transgender and how that has become so important in the political scenes. Does your book address any of those issues, or does it identify any of those topics?
Yeah, well, I jump into this question about, how do we think about what is a woman is the way it's often discussed, right? And, I think throughout the book, I just want to be really clear, the idea is to sort of talk about the biology and how the biology touches on these issues. I'm not trying to make anybody's mind up for them or anything like that. I want this book to be a common ground where we can have this discussion around the evidence and around the biology. But I think it's an example of how these things get so difficult. If the question about transgender inclusion and rights is, how do we treat people on the street? Well, I think that's, in one way that has nothing to do with the biology. That's to do with how we treat each other as humans. If the question is, are we going to include everyone do we include transgender women in the female category in sport, right? Well, that's a much harder question, because we know there really are these differences in size and strength and endurance that having a male biology gives you.
Sure.
And so what's fair in one context, a social context, might not always be as fair in a sporting context, for example. So we might have to be kind of context. We might have to be a little more sophisticated in how I think about these things, and say, well, the context matters, and who gets to be included in which groups is going to socially and or in sporting or whatever is going to matter depending on the context as well.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. I guess the reader's going to have to look by the book and look up the topic in the book, Adaptability, and find answers to the questions themselves. Let's talk about intelligence and genetics from the book, Adaptable. It explores the genetic factors influencing intelligence, which is a sensitive subject due to the historic misuse of intelligence and research. Please do explain to our viewers what your intake has been on this and how do you explain that in your book, Adaptable.
Yeah, well, my real world introduction into how complicated this is when I was working with the Hadza community in northern Tanzania. They have a completely different background. They grew up in a completely different lifestyle. And when I go out and walk with men and hunt with them, for example, during the day, or even go out with women and gather plant foods, their intelligence and what they've learned and how they've learned to survive in that environment always blows me away. And I realize I don't have a very high IQ for a Hadza man. But, when I was growing up in my environment, in my culture, I did pretty well. I did well on school and stuff like that. So that's just a nice example to show that what we think of as IQ is largely to do with what we've been able to learn, how our cultures taught us. The human brain comes into the world unfinished, right? That's actually a feature, not a bug. That's how we're evolved to be born into this world with our brains ready to absorb all the information that our culture has. And no matter where you grow up, it takes you until your late teens or early 20s to really be able to absorb it all. That's how long it takes to learn how to be an adult, basically, which is why every culture everywhere, people aren't getting married until late teens, even early 20s, right? That's how life has to go for us because there's so much to learn. And so, when we are trying to compare, IQ tests across groups, it's really pretty meaningless because if you have any difference in your background and what you've been taught or how you've been taught to learn, that's what you're going to be measuring in these IQ differences between groups. So, we shouldn't be scared about IQ differences that we see between groups. Those are pretty meaningless. What those tell us is how different people are raised with different priorities. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing as someone with, higher or lower cognitive ability, IQ, smarts, whatever you want to call it, within a group. So when we compare a bunch of, for example, 8-year-olds in the same class, in the same community that have all had the exact same background, we're going to find out, any fourth grade teacher will tell you, some kids get things faster, some kids take longer. Yeah. So there is within group differences in our cognitive abilities. Those have to do with the way our brains are wired. Some of that has to do with, and this goes back to the early days of IQ testing, different kinds of IQ. Are you more quantitative? Are you more verbal? Right? So there's different strengths that way. But we know that people, we're not saying everybody's exactly the same and equal, right? Because we know that's not true. And so the modern studies that we see these days pointing to different genetic influences on IQ, we shouldn't be worried about those. Those aren't scary. Those are interesting. And those are telling us how the brain is built and what genes are involved. That's why we see the differences within groups. I think when it gets really misused is when it's treated as sort of as a way to keep particular groups down, because these between group differences aren't very meaningful.
Thank you for explaining that, Dr. Pontzer. We're going to discuss another final topic from your book, and that's about personhood. A developing embryo or a fetus becomes a person, engages with then ethical, legal, philosophical dimensions. But you've raised that question in your book that a lot of development starts when you're a fetus. Explain us, what does personhood mean, and why is it important for our audience to know about it?
Sure. So, I begin the book actually talking about our embryology, the way you go from just one fertilized cell and grow into this amazing, human body that we all get to have for our lives. It's a really important thing to understand if you're going to understand our biology in general. So it's really the foundation for a lot of things. But, you kind of can't start talking about that without beginning to wonder, okay, well, when does this just a cell or a couple of cells, and when is this something that I'd call a person? And again, the biology doesn't tell us that. That's an ethical question, right? And we want to separate up biology, which tells us how things work, from philosophy and ethics that tell us, what we ought to care about. That's a different set of questions. But I think, for me anyway, ethics and philosophy should be based on some biological understanding. And if we take that approach, well, then it gets kind of interesting. So, for example, the egg that was fertilized to become the fertilized egg that became you, that egg was produced in your mother's body when she was a fetus. So that egg was already several decades old by the time it was fertilized. So when did you begin? Do you begin that then or now? If we call fertilized eggs, if we say, well, that's a person, well, that gets really complicated, because sometimes fertilized eggs and egg clusters separate and become identical twins. Well, so when do they become individual people, right? Sometimes you have separate embryos that fuse together. So is it two people that become one person? How do we understand that, right? So when you understand the details of the embryology very quickly, you realize that that where you draw the line is not at all as simple as often it's talked about. So I wanted to kind of to get people to think about that. Where I come to in the book is I think most definitions of personhood might sort of require some sense of self, right? A brain that can understand that you're an individual, at least some limited, at least, ability to do that. And if we look at it that way, well, then brains aren't really kind of developed enough to have that ability. We don't think until maybe 22, 23 weeks, something like that. But just to try to get that conversation going is the idea behind that chapter, just to think about embryology in this sort of evidence-based way, rather than as some abstract thing that's sort of easy, because it's not easy. It's actually quite complicated and interesting.
Thank you for explaining that. Let's go to another question, Dr. Pontzer. Basically, what's upcoming? And one of the things that is out there, talked about a lot, and people curious, is AI. How do you feel that it's going to affect your field in terms of research, in terms of findings, in terms of other stuff? Has there been any insight, or is there anything on the horizons as far as your work or your colleagues are concerned?
Well, I think there's some real opportunity there. I mean, if we think about what AI is good at, AI is good at basically looking across the globe at everything ever written and gathering it all together in some coherent way. That takes a person years to do sometimes, depending on the project, right? So when I think about the kind of work I do, where I want to understand not just how something works here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, I want to understand how it works in different cultures across the globe. Well, gathering that kind of data across all these sites and cultures, AI might be really good at that, and it might accelerate that kind of research and help us, think about human diversity in a more meaningful way, and think about these sort of big comparative questions in a more meaningful way. I worry about a couple things. One is if people using large language models to write, right? So this is a big issue for me in the classroom. Students are using this to do term papers and that kind of stuff. I think that's a mistake, because to write is to think. And I think the more that we, take that exercise away of writing it yourself and we give that to a machine, the less we exercise those muscles, our brain muscles. So I think, writing is an important piece of thinking. And I worry what happens when we take that away. And then of course, there's all the sort of existential worries about, what happens to global systems when AI becomes ever present, and will it crash economies and that kind of stuff. I worry about that too, but I'm less equipped to have an expert opinion on those big issues.
Thank you for highlighting that. And it's not only you that worried about it. A lot of other people have similar sort of concerns. And you put it nicely. To write is to think. So yeah, that's nicely said. Any final message for our audience?
I would say that, so much of what we think we understand about how the world works is based on, what ends up being a pretty narrow view of things. It's what you see in your community. It's what you see in your sort of curated social media posts. In fact, the world's this big, diverse, complex place. Adaptable is a book about how we understand that diversity, about why your body works differently than mine, and where each of us is unique. And when we understand that, we kind of understand how diversity develops just out of our biology. So I hope people will use it as a springboard to that, but also just kind of stay curious and ask questions and try to understand how the world is really working outside of our narrow bubbles, because it's so easy these days to kind of stay confined in that. So I'd push people to kind of push beyond that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Herman. Appreciate your valuable insight with us today. Thank you very much for coming to the show. And we're hoping you're going to do well with the book. It's a brilliantly written book. So, best of luck with that and just generally in your career and the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. It was a fun conversation.
Thank you. And to our amazing audience, thank you for tuning in for another episode of KhanKlinics. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and feel free to drop your comments. We love hearing from you. Don't forget to spread the word. Tell your friends about us. Have a good evening.